Hello, I'm Sean Rehaag. I'm the director of York University's Center for Refugee Studies and a faculty member at Osgoode Hall Law School. This video is part of the CRS Online Introduction to Refugee Studies. In this video, we'll be discussing different categories of forced migration. We'll be paying attention not only to how we categorize forced migrants, but also the impact that these categories have on policy and on the interests and well-being of forced migrants and other displaced people. So let's jump right in. What do we mean when we talk about forced migration? We're going to adopt the definition of forced migration from the International Association for the Studies of Forced Migration. They define the term as follows. Forced migration refers to the movements of refugees and internally displaced people. It covers those displaced by conflicts, as well as people displaced by natural or environmental disasters, chemical or nuclear disasters, famine, or development projects. Notice that this definition envisions three different kinds of forced migration. The first is conflict-induced displacement. This covers people who are forced to flee because of human rights violations, generalized violence, specific persecution, or other types of conflict. The second type of forced migration is development-induced displacement. This covers people who are displaced due to economic development, such as the Three Gorges Dam in China, which displaced over 1.2 million people. The third type of forced migration is disaster-induced displacement. This covers people who are fleeing natural disasters, such as floods or earthquakes, environmental change, such as deforestation, desertification, and climate change, and human-made disasters, such as industrial accidents. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the motivations for migration may be mixed. That is, a person may seek to migrate because of a combination of push factors and pull factors. So, for example, a person may choose to leave their country because of a lack of employment, and they may choose to go to a particular country because there are lots of jobs available. So they are being pushed out of their country by the lack of employment, and they are being pulled to another country because of the availability of jobs. When we speak of forced migration, however, the push factors predominate. People have to flee their homes, often quite suddenly. They may not have any choice in terms of which country they go to. They may, for example, simply go to the most readily available country, the most accessible country. While thinking about push and pull factors can sometimes be helpful, we must also be cautious not to oversimplify complex phenomena. For example, imagine that a person has no choice but to flee their country to avoid persecution on account of their religion. And imagine that that same person seeks out a particular country because there are jobs available. That person is engaged in mixed migration. They're affected by both push factors and pull factors. Nonetheless, they may still be categorized as a forced migrant. Now, this reflects a tension when thinking about forced migration. That tension is the desire to fit people into distinct, well-defined categories, and the reality that individual situations are often much more complex than these categories would suggest. The practice of categorizing and defining people does have some important benefits. Once we know which category a person fits into, we can more easily identify which legal or political regime applies to them, which in turn determines what rights and entitlements they have, what treatment they are entitled to, and who is responsible for them. However, this practice of categorizing can also be very problematic, as not all vulnerable migrants fit into well-established legal categories. Nevertheless, because of the way that the international and domestic systems are structured, these categories are still important. Although too often used interchangeably by the media and the general public, there are crucial differences between the categories. Okay, so let's look into those categories in a bit more detail. The next category that we're going to look at is migrant. The term migrant is an umbrella term that is not defined under international law. Generally, A migrant is understood as a person who moves away from his or her place of usual residence, whether within a country or across an international border, temporarily or permanently, and for a variety of reasons. Under this umbrella term, we can include migrant workers, refugees, internally displaced persons, immigrants, and many others. In the media, we often hear the term illegal migrants used to refer to people who have crossed a border without proper documentation. This terminology is problematic because it is often legally inaccurate and discriminatory. Moreover, migrants are people, and a person cannot be illegal. When referring to someone who is moving outside of regular migration channels without authorization under the laws and regulations governing the entry into or exit from a state, it is more appropriate to refer to an undocumented or irregular migrant. Next, let's look at the term refugee. We will examine the refugee definition in depth in the video on international refugee law. But for now, at its most basic, a refugee is someone who meets the definition of a refugee under the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. According to this convention, a refugee is a person who has been forced to flee his or her country because of a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Sometimes the term refugee is used to encompass a broader group of people. For instance, the 1969 Organization of African Unity Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa includes individuals that are defined as refugees under the 1951 Convention, but also extends the definitions to include other individuals. This includes people who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order, are compelled to leave their place of habitual residence in order to seek refuge in another place outside their country of origin or nationality. People may also be considered refugees if they meet the conditions set out in domestic laws. Similarly, people may be considered refugees if they have this status by virtue of a United Nations High Commission for Refugees statute. Finally, the term is sometimes applied to people who are granted complementary forms of protection. This means other forms of protection created by domestic law other than convention refugee status that is conferred on people who cannot be returned to their country of origin and who are in need of some form of protection. Now, remember, this is just a brief account of the definition of a refugee. If you're interested in learning more, please view our video on international refugee law. Asylum seekers. An asylum seeker is a person who has crossed an international border in search of protection under the 1951 Convention, but whose claim for refugee protection has not yet been determined. Not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but every refugee is initially an asylum seeker. Internally displaced persons. There isn't a clear definition under international law of internally displaced persons, often referred to as IDPs. However, one frequently cited definition is found in a United Nations report, The Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. That document defines IDPs as persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes as a result of, or in order to avoid the effects of, armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-based disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. Unlike refugees, IDPs remain in their countries of origin and remain under the jurisdiction of their government, even if that government is ultimately the reason for their displacement. As a result, they are often found in areas where it is logistically or politically difficult to deliver humanitarian assistance, and thus IDPs are among the most vulnerable people in the world. Additionally, There is no binding international treaty that specifically addresses the situations of IDPs or that offers them protection. Instead, they are subject to the domestic law of the state and can only look to international human rights law for protection. The United Nations Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement, however, despite not being binding international law, do point to some important rules in this area. The guiding principles address protection against displacement, protection during displacement, frameworks for humanitarian assistance, protection during return, local integration into the locations where people have been displaced, and resettlement in another part of the country. The principles restate the right of individuals not to be arbitrarily displaced and prohibit displacement on ethnic, religious, or racial grounds. They also state that IDPs are entitled to enjoy the same rights and freedoms under international and domestic law as do other persons in the country without discrimination. The principles also reaffirm that national authorities have primary responsibilities to ensure that the IDP's basic rights are met, and that those authorities should accept international assistance when they do not have the capacity to provide assistance and protection to IDPs themselves. In mid-2019, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees reported that there were 43.9 million IDPs in the world. 42% of all IDPs that year were located in 3 countries: Colombia, Syria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Stateless persons. A stateless person is a person who is not considered a national or a citizen by any state under the operation of its laws. Some people are born stateless, others become stateless because of discrimination against particular ethnic or religious groups, or on the basis of gender, because of gaps in nationality laws, or because of changes in the territory of a state. Being stateless often places people in a very vulnerable position. Without a nationality, stateless people may be prevented from enrolling in school, accessing medical assistance, working, opening a bank account, owning property, or even getting married. In short, stateless people often cannot fully participate in the public life of the state in which they reside. Statelessness can be both a cause of displacement as well as a result of it. For instance, children born in refugee camps are often at risk of being stateless. Not all stateless people are refugees or are even displaced. And certainly, not all refugees are stateless. However, there are at least 1.5 million refugees in the world who are also stateless, and many more displaced people are at risk of becoming stateless. The very nature of statelessness means that it's difficult to determine the exact number of stateless persons in the world, but the United Nations High Commission for Refugees estimates that statelessness affects at least 12 million people worldwide. Perhaps the largest group currently in this category are stateless Rohingya refugees from Myanmar, over 900,000 of whom have fled into Bangladesh. Unaccompanied minors. An unaccompanied minor is a person who is under the age of majority, usually 18, or who is a child, as defined in Article 1 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They must also be separated from their parents and must not be cared for by an adult who, by law or custom, has responsibility to do so. In dealing with these children, the overriding objective must be to act in the best interests of the child. Unaccompanied minors are often particularly vulnerable to human trafficking and other forms of harm. Economic migrant. Although the term economic migrant is often used, it does not have a legal definition. In common speech, economic migrant or labor migrant refers to a person who leaves his or her home for purely economic reasons that are not related to the refugee definition. In other words, a person who migrates to seek to improve his or her livelihood. This term is so broad as to be of minimal use. It can be applied both to the seasonal agricultural worker from Mexico who picks strawberries in southern Ontario and the Harvard University graduate who takes a job at the London Stock Exchange. Environmental migrant. Environmental migrants are persons who, predominantly for reasons of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions, are forced to leave their homes or choose to do so either temporarily or permanently, and who move either within or outside their country of origin. Although we often hear the media speaking about, quote, environmental refugees, unquote, this is actually a misnomer. People who are fleeing environmental changes do not generally meet the definition of refugees. That said, this is one of the fastest growing categories of migrants, and with increasing unpredictability in climate and environmental patterns, it is likely that the urgency of addressing the environmental needs of migrants will grow in importance in the coming years. It is also possible, and we are already seeing this in a handful of decisions, that international refugee law will be pushed and expanded to address this group of migrants. Okay, so now we've gone through many different categories and definitions that are used in the field of forced migration. I do, however, want to emphasize a point that I made at the outset, namely that we need to be cautious about categories and definitions as they apply in this field. That's because, in reality, people's motivations to flee, their circumstances, their modes of transit, and various other factors that influence what category of migration that they fall into are often quite multifaceted and mixed. For example, for a person belonging to an oppressed minority group or in a country where a civil war exists, finding stable employment may be impossible, pushing her to seek opportunities elsewhere. Is that person an economic migrant, a refugee, or some combination? Additionally, different legal frameworks may apply to migrants at different points along their journey. A smuggled migrant might become a victim of human trafficking, or an irregular migrant might become a refugee due to a change of circumstances in the country of origin. As noted at the beginning of this video, categorizing migrants is a complex endeavor. That endeavor is made more challenging by the fact that individuals and groups may have multiple reasons for migrating, and they may be subject to multiple legal regimes. This phenomena is referred to as mixed migration flows. Within flows of mixed migration, there will be individuals with differing levels of vulnerability and with different legal entitlements. Regardless of which particular entitlement any given migrant enjoys, however, it is essential to keep in mind that all migrants, not just forced migrants, are entitled to respect for their human rights.